morning, one and all. Welcome to Roof Tropics Media. Welcome to Conversations with Dr. Anderson Reynolds. Today we will be sharing a very different conversation with you. My guest for this morning couldn't make it, but as they say, every disappointment is a blessing. So I have taken this opportunity to share with you my journey as a writer, how I became a writer, and why do I write. We will begin the conversation with a bio of me to give you a proper introduction of me in terms of my educational, professional, and creative life.
The biography of Dr. Anderson Reynolds. Anderson Reynolds was born and raised in Vieux-Fort, St. Lucia, to Seventh-day Adventists parents, Philomene née Francis and St. Bryce Reynolds. He is the seventh of 9 children. His mother was an enterprising housewife, and his father was a tailor who doubled as a farmer, beekeeper, and transporter of passengers and bananas. In August 1979, at the age of 21, he left St. Lucia for America to pursue a college education. He graduated from Louisiana State University, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in 1982 with a bachelor's degree in agricultural economics and a master's degree in the same field in 1985. In 1989, he received his doctorate degree in food and resource economics from the University of Florida, Gainesville, Florida. After graduation, he took a position as visiting professor of agricultural economics at the University of Guelph, Ontario. And in March 1991, after 1.5 years at the University of Guelph, he returned to the US to work as a corporate economist with Southwestern Bell, St. Louis, Missouri. In March 1999, after 9 years with Southwestern Bell, he resettled in St. Lucia. Upon his resettlement, Dr. Reynolds founded Jacko Productions, a cultural and entertainment enterprise that seeks to encourage the artistic expression of St. Lucian culture and to promote that culture worldwide through its website, social media, the publication of books and magazines, the production of music and film, the management of artists, and the staging of musical, literary, and other cultural events. In St. Lucia, Dr. Reynolds has held the position of Senior Economist at the Eastern Caribbean Telecommunication Authority, ECTEL. He served as the president of the Southern Tourism Development Corporation, and he has served on the St. Lucia National Reparation Committee, the St. Lucia National Utility Regulatory Commission, and on the board of directors of the St. Lucia Livestock Development Company, Radio St. Lucia, the St. Lucia Tourist Board, and the Eastern Caribbean Collective Organization for Music Rights, ECHO. In recent years, Dr. Reynolds has emerged as one of St. Lucia's most prominent and prolific writers. Besides his 2 latest books, No Man's Land, a political introspection of St. Lucia, and the memoir, My Father is No Longer There, his first book, the novel Death by Fire, won the 2001 M&C Main Award for Literature. His second book, The Struggle for Survival, an Historical, Political, and Socioeconomic Perspective of St. Lucia, won a 2003 M&C Prize for Prose. And his third book, a novel titled The Stall Keeper, was the winner of the 2012 National Arts Award for Prose. Besides writing books, Dr. Reynolds is a regular contributor of feature articles to the nation's major newspapers, and he served as the chief editor and a principal writer for the Jacko magazine. His newspaper articles won him a 2001 M&C Literature Award for creative journalism, and his writings for the Jaco won the 2006 National Arts Award for creative journalism. Dr. Reynolds' books and journalistic pieces have established him as a foremost authority on St. Lucia's socio-economic and political history.
So, the first question is, how did I become a writer? How did my journey as a writer begin? And when did I discover that I could write? Well, it may surprise you to hear me say that English was my worst and most dreaded subject at secondary school. I, who have 5 books published, with a 6th book, they call him Brother George, Portrait of a Caribbean Politician, on the way. But you see, I grew up with an unusual speech and writing impediment. It was almost impossible for me to translate my thoughts into spoken or written words. I was always able to do well enough in school to move on to the next stage. But for me, schoolwork was some kind of a last-minute getaway game. I usually did class assignments, especially those that involve writing essays, at the last minute or not at all. Putting my thoughts on paper was like having a nightmare in which I am being chased by a monster. But something is holding me back, preventing me from running away. Nonetheless, as the monster stretches out his hands to catch me, my fear is so great that I am forced to surmount all my energy, break the spell of immobility, and escape from the dragon in the nick of time. In sitting exams, I would waste most of the exam time on the first few questions, trying hard to come up with the right words that would capture what I wanted to express. It was so bad that the exam time would be almost over, yet half of the questions would remain unanswered. At that point, under the panic of failure, I would abandon exactitude, grammar, spelling, and punctuation marks, and in a frenzy of writing, I would just barely complete the exam. So throughout secondary school and right into my PhD program, I answered most exam questions in the final minutes of the exam time. Indeed, for me, sitting exams was a panic attack. Because of the difficulty of giving expression to my thoughts, I was forced to come up with my own language, a language developed under extreme pressure, and thus one that had no time for grammar, punctuation marks, and proper diction. This worked fine with family and friends, people who had accepted this idiosyncrasy of mine as a form of mental retardation. At school, it also worked okay with subjects other than English. But when English was the subject, this language of mine spelled doom. So this was why English was my most dreaded subject. At Louisiana State University, I started my master's program with plenty of apprehension. Part of the master's requirement was a thesis. But how could I write an acceptable thesis given the state of my writing? So, motivated by the fear of failure, one of my stated goals in graduate school was to improve my writing. Accordingly, I bought a large Webster dictionary, a thesaurus, and the Hodges Harbrace grammar book. I was determined to excel because my future was at stake. 2 semesters into the program, my writing was brought to the test. the Graduate Student Association of my department was putting out a news article, and I was asked to write an article in recognition of two professors in their role as editors of the Southern Journal of Agricultural Economics. With much skepticism, I accepted, and as usual, I waited till the last day before the article was due to start working on the assignment. The heat was on. I had to complete the paper in a few hours. I hurried to the professors' offices to interview them about their role as editors of the journal and also their advice to graduate students concerning submitting papers for publication. Next, I went to my office and began writing. But there was no time to give the matter much thought. My time was up. The following day, after the news article was out, much to my surprise, just about everyone in the department, including professors, congratulated me on the paper. I was elated. That very day, I realized that despite my dread and dislike of writing, I could write. You see, although I had been in school most of my life, most of the time I was sitting in the classrooms, I wished I was someplace else. My dream had been to be a great soccer player, replace Pelé, a great musician, make way Bob Marley, a great cricketer, watch out Sobers, an Olympic gold medal track athlete, step aside Carl Lewis. Somehow, I knew a creative power lodged inside me, but to realize that power in concrete form had eluded me. Apart from soccer, I had not excelled at much else. I tried cricket, track and field, painting, even learning to sing and play the guitar. But fortunately, or unfortunately, my creative powers lied in none of the above. So after it occurred to me I could write, I began thinking that maybe, just maybe, writing was my art, the creative force I knew existed within me. As if to reinforce this realization, a month later the department head asked me to write a letter recommending a professor for a scholarly award. However, my fear of writing was still not over. And once again, I waited till the last day before the letter was due to get started. Again, after writing the letter, I was disappointed with my creation. But as usual, there was no time for perfection. After getting the letter typed and turned in, I showed a copy to a colleague, and he thought it was great, but I wasn't convinced. However, after a few weeks, I reread the letter, and to my disbelieving eyes, it was great. Thanks to the passage of time, I had finally discovered my art. But then that didn't mean I am a writer. A letter and a news article doesn't a writer make. So despite this discovery, it was only after I had completed my master's degree and had embarked on my PhD that it occurred to me that I was going to be writing books. How did I come to this realization? Well, by then I had become aware that most things I read, I had either come across similar material or just by stretching my knowledge base a little, I could have come up with similar analyses. In other words, reading was no more the fresh, tantalizing, beguiling activity it once was. This suggested to me that it was time that I started writing my own books. Then I did not know what kind of books I would write, whether fiction or non-fiction. All what I knew was that I was going to be writing books. This notion that I had to be a writer was later reinforced by a dream in which someone asked, what would be my biggest regret if I were to die tonight? And to my surprise, my biggest regret wasn't that I was yet to travel the world, or that I was yet to marry and start a family, but that there was no book in any bookstore or library with my name on it. This told me right then and there that no matter what else is going on in my life, I must keep writing. The notion that I was destined to be a writer was further reinforced when, in late 1991, while browsing a newspaper stand, I came across a tourist magazine with an article on Derek Walcott, stating that Walcott had been mentioned twice in a row as possible nominations for the Nobel Prize, and concluding it was inevitable he would win it. Before this article, I was only vaguely aware of Walcott as a poet and playwright. I was unaware he was such a prominent writer. After reading the article, I hastened to the bookstore and picked up a copy of Walcott's Morrison. I was in for a treat. Here was Walcott talking about me, about the place of my birth and upbringing, about the way I feel about my people and my country. I read Morrison twice, and since then, I've bought and read most of Walcott's plays and poems. In Worldcuts' work, I found many gems. It was there, for the first time, I found out that the Charbonnairs, the women coal carriers who balancing 100-weight baskets of coals on their heads, were chiefly responsible for unloading and uploading coal onto ships at the Castries Wharf during the era of steamboats when coal was used as fuel. It was in Walcott's work also that I found out Charbin means red nigger. From just one line of Walcott's poems, I was able to visualize the coal carrying operations of the Charbonnairs, which, in my novel, Death by Fire, allowed me to write a whole passage describing the Charbonnairs in action. Later, when I was working on my second book, The Struggle for Survival, an historical, political, and socio-economic perspective of St. Lucia, I found a picture carried in the National Geographic magazine and taken in the 1920s of the Charbonnairs in operation. The picture matched almost exactly the image I had formed from Walcott's poem. And I am glad to say that I was happy to use that picture for the book cover of The Struggle for Survival. So you could well imagine how I felt when, on the evening of October 8th, 1992, a few months after reading the article on Derek Walcott, straight out of work, I flicked on the television, and as if by magic, there was Derek Walcott being asked what winning the Nobel Prize meant to him. I jumped from the sofa and screamed, oblivious of my neighbors. Immediately after, I started calling close friends, spreading the news. But this wasn't enough. So in the morning, I bought donuts to work and kept an impromptu breakfast party to celebrate with my American friends. But this still wasn't enough. So Saturday evening, I kept a house party to celebrate with friends. At the party, we watched a documentary on St. Lucia and offered a toast to Derek Walcott and St. Lucia. Yet, I remained in a state of pride and excitement. So I wrote a tribute to our Nobel laureates, which was published in the St. Lucia Voice newspaper. A year after Derek Walcott won the Nobel Prize, I received even further reinforcement on my destiny as a writer when I switched on my television, and there a writer whom I was seeing and finding about for the first time was being interviewed. I asked myself, who is this thoughtful and regal woman? She was Toni Morrison, an African American. Next day, I hurried to the bookstore and bought one of her novels, The Bluest Eye. From the first sentence of that novel, I fell in love with Toni Morrison's work. She has written 11 novels. By the way, she passed away a couple years ago. May she rest in peace. And I have read every one of them 3-4 times and still counting. Why this fascination with Toni Morrison? Well, there are 2 reasons. First, she has the uncanny ability to get to the essentials of an entity. the essentials without which the entity would no longer be what it is. And then she colors those essentials so they become in full view, in the process making the entity more of what it is. Second, Toni Morrison writes the way I think. Just imagine the thrill of reading an author who speaks the way you think. Discovering Toni Morrison was one of the best things that have happened to me in my adult life. I've never met Toni Morrison, but she's the closest thing to be serving as a writing coach to me. But let me share a little joke with you. In St. Louis, Missouri, Toni Morrison came to do a book event, a book reading and signing. The line to enter the venue stretched like a marathon. So before I could get in, the place was overcrowded. So I didn't get to see and meet and listen to my favorite author. I was annoyed. I said, look at me that I've bought all her books, read them several times, cannot get in. And I'm sure there are people there who probably haven't read her books and they are there with her. My girlfriend at the time had a good laugh because by then she had gotten tired of me always boasting Toni Morrison. So that day she got her revenge. Later that same year, when Toni Morrison won the Nobel Prize in Literature, I started thinking, what a coincidence that just a few months after discovering Toni Morrison, she would win the Nobel Prize. But then I said almost out loud, hold on, wasn't that the same thing I said when Derek Walcott won the prize? Coincidence my foot. Someone is trying to tell me something. And considering my dream about what would be my biggest regret if I died, I said to myself, that something must be that I was meant to be a writer. As with Toni Morrison novels, I keep revisiting Worldcuts' work, and on each visit, I am always amazed at the depth, breadth, and richness of his writings. Earlier I said that it was only after I had completed my master's degree and had embarked on my PhD that it occurred to me that I was going to be writing books. And I had come to that realization when I became aware that most things I read I had either come across similar material or just by stretching my knowledge base a little, I could have come up with similar analyses. That's all nice and dandy, but fanciful thoughts and realizations doesn't write books. For example, what do you write about? Well, in my case, I followed the old adage, write what you know. I took it to heart. I began with what I knew best, myself. I toiled for the better part of a year over a biographical novel. But after completion, I was dissatisfied with the product. Clearly, I was too green in the art of writing. The manuscript wasn't good enough to deserve publication. And I'm not one to believe that simply because one has written a book, a manuscript, completed a manuscript, that it should be published. In my case, I'm only willing to publish a manuscript, a book, when I think it deserves to be published, when I think it is of sufficient value to be published. Clearly, I was too green in the art of writing. But there was a second reason why I didn't attempt to get it published. Being about myself, the manuscript necessarily revealed things about my family. I wasn't sure how this would play out with them, so I shelved the manuscript. But interestingly enough, the manuscript has proven to be far from useless. I cannot count the number of times that I have gone back and mined it for other writing projects. However, at the time, the only purpose the manuscript had served was that it had gotten my feet wet in the writing process. Shelving the manuscript left me in search of another writing project. There was a crime that took place in St. Lucia in 1971, 1972 that shocked the nation and that left a lasting impression on me. Most things that I have written about are things that occupied my mind since childhood. So in searching for my next writing project, I said, why don't I use this crime as the ending of a novel? And then my task would be to develop a story with the crime as its ending. This second writing project would help me decide whether I could truly write a novel, whether I could actually dream up my own characters and come up with my own plot, a departure from my biographical novel in which the characters and plot were handed down to me. So I avoided researching the crime in question or the lives of the characters involved. My task would be to create everything from scratch. From childhood, I have always been enchanted with the beauty of St. Lucia, its culture, its future. In fact, during my 20-year stay in America, every time I visited home, I was always taken aback by the beauty of the island. Maybe having been born and raised in a Seventh-day Adventist home in which I was denied my own culture, because the Seventh-day Adventists regarded most of the social and cultural activities on the island as worldly and ungodly, and therefore off limits, was why I had such a hunger for St. Lucia. Nevertheless, it was this hunger for St. Lucia that made me want to capture in this second work as much St. Lucian culture and history as possible. So the purpose of writing this novel, which I would call Death by Fire, which, by the way, the title was taken from Derek Worldcuts' famous poem, A City's Death by Fire, where he describes the burning of Castries in the 1948 fire, was twofold. First, to prove to myself that I could write a novel, and second, to share with the world the history and culture of St. Lucia. I wrote the novel during the course of a year, but over a period of 4 years, I constantly revisited the manuscript, adding, deleting, rephrasing. Also during that time, I started attending book readings and writing workshops, and I took a fiction writing course at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. After the course, I went to the manuscript to give it the benefit of what I had learned. Through all this, one thing remained constant. Each time I read the novel, I was totally convinced that it deserved to be published, and it should be a must-read for all St. Lucians. The writing and publication of Death by Fire proved that I could write a novel. But what proof was there that I was a writer? In my mind, one novel doesn't make a writer. In other words, when could I consider myself a writer? But at this point, let us play another clip to that speaks to my body of work, my body of writing, and that seeks to characterize my writing, give you a sense of the nature of what I write.
Dr. Reynolds' writing, be it fictional or non-fictional, has been described as a world in which a great drama unfolds, where history, geography, nature, culture, the supernatural, and socio-economic factors all combine to seal the fate of characters, communities, or for that matter, the fate of whole nations or civilizations. In this crucible of a world, readers are provided with deep insights into where St. Lucians come from, who they are as a people, and how they became who they are. His first book, the novel Death by Fire, presents a world plagued by supernatural malevolence, natural and man-made catastrophes, and the vagaries and unkindness of history. In the presence of these life-changing forces, the novel follows the lives of two boys being raised by single parents as they pursue a life of escalating crime. As such, the book presents a sociological contemplation on the root causes of poverty and deprivation, and posits that sometimes the neglect of a child produces nearly the same fate as the hatred of a child. His second book, The Struggle for Survival, a historical, political, and socio-economic perspective of St. Lucia, retells the story of the tragic 1993 island-wide banana strike that culminated in the shooting death of two banana farmers. However, by going beyond the tragedy and delving into the island's history, farmers' struggles against droughts, hurricanes, falling prices, corrupt institutions, and multinational corporations, we see a microcosm of the struggles of a people against slavery, colonialism, imperialism, dispossession, marginalization, and natural calamities. Against the backdrop of American World War II occupation of Beaufort and the damaged culture the occupation wrought, Dr. Reynolds' third book and second novel, The Stallkeeper, examines the lives of the town's inhabitants as they struggle to find love, acceptance, and material success. In so doing, the novel presents a meditation on the nature of fate and offers food for thought on why Beaufortians are the way they are. Dr. Reynolds' fourth book, the memoir My Father Is No Longer There, was inspired by his father's accidental death. He said that the book was an attempt to reconcile himself to his father's sudden and premature death and to get to know him better than when he was alive. The book presents a meditation on the nature of death, the value of a life, and the nature of art and creativity. It is an exploration of family values, the depths of parental love and sacrifice, and the importance of parent-child bonding. In his fifth book, No Man's Land, a political introspection of St. Lucia, Dr. Reynolds dissects St. Lucian politics and society to pinpoint what is wrong with the country's political system and how to fix it. The book speaks to the hold history has on the country and how race, partisanship, provincialism, and opportunism cloud the political process. It is a meditation on issues of patrimony, sovereignty, nationhood, corruption, and political empowerment. In this world of Anderson Reynolds, is there any escape or any hope of rising above circumstances of birth and geography? Well, maybe. A hint of an answer is provided in The Struggle for Survival, where the narrator says, "But refusing to take a page from history, farmers went on a strike and history repeated itself." So, in the world of Anderson Reynolds, knowledge and understanding of one's history and culture represent the only possible means of escape from one's fate. In other words, man, know thyself and do thyself no harm. But even so, there are no guarantees. For in The Stallkeeper, Reuben was well equipped with a knowledge of history and culture, yet this did not prevent his downfall.
So folks, we are still on how do I know I'm a writer? When can I consider myself a writer? As I said before, most of my books are about events in St. Lucia that left a lasting impression upon me. When the 1993 banana strike that culminated in the shooting death of two farmers played out, I was still living in the US, but like most St. Lucians at home and abroad, I was traumatized by this event. In The Struggle for Survival, my second book, I wanted to write St. Lucian history that reads like a novel. So I used the story of the striking banana farmers to give the book a narrative feel. And with broad strokes, I weaved in the history of St. Lucia, the history of the banana industry, and the history of St. Lucian politics. And in the third edition, I included a chapter on the 1950s St. Lucia Arts Guild that sparked a cultural renaissance, led Caribbean theater, and out of which emerged such cultural creative giants as the Worldcuts brothers, Dunstan St. Omer, Gav St. Omer, and Charles Cadet. Interestingly, that chapter is now the longest chapter in the book. There was this man in Vieux-Fort in my preteen years who was a stallkeeper. People also regarded him as what they call a malmaman, sorry for the political incorrectness. That man rose from selling out of trays to opening a thriving retail store. And then tragedy struck. His store burned to ashes. And he never returned to owning a store. The notion that a person can work hard all his life and just when he has arrived, he can lose it all stayed with me throughout my life. So when in a fiction writing course at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, I was required to write a short story, I chose the stallkeeper and the tragedy as the subject of my story. Years later, I expanded the story into a novel, in the process weaving as much of the history of Vieux-Fort into the story, and attempted to provide a sense of why Vieux-Fort is the way it is. Even after such reinforcements as the epiphany I experienced with Derek Worldcuts and Toni Morrison winning the Nobel Prize back-to-back soon after, so to speak, discovering them, and even after having 3 of my books published, I was still questioning my legitimacy as a writer. What right do I have to be imposing my writing on the world? Who appointed me a writer? Who appointed me God? In confronting this issue of my legitimacy, it began to dawn upon me that many great writers, artists, and creative thinkers are people who were born and raised on the fringes of society. They were outsiders. Derek Worldcuts speaks about being a divided child, a Shabin, a red nigger, a child of European and African ancestry. He also talks about growing up as a Methodist, looking on Roman Catholic rituals and pageantry with a feeling of missing out. This dividedness made him different and so placed him at the edges of St. Lucian society. The writings of and interviews with V.S. Naipaul, the Caribbean's newest Nobel laureate, clearly suggests he didn't fit in anywhere. He was the consummate outsider. And an examination of my life suggests that I too have been an outsider all my life. As revealed in my 4th book, My Father is No Longer There, my strange and abnormal relationship with my mother made me a stranger in my own home. And as a Seventh-day Adventist in a town and a country that was 90% Roman Catholic, my family and I were strangers in our own culture. At 20, I emigrated to America, but as a black man and a foreigner, I was a minority within a minority. So my outsider status was even more acute in the US than in St. Lucia. I returned to St. Lucia 20 years later. I'm no longer an Adventist. I backslide at the age of 18 and never turned back. And even if I still were, I wouldn't be much of a minority any longer, because with over 40 churches, Adventism has gained a much larger share of the population. Nevertheless, I have come back with an American way of seeing and doing things, and a level of education that sets me apart from most of the population. So to some extent, I'm a stranger in my own country, and it seems I'm destined to remain forever an outsider. In this regard, my latest book, No Man's Land, a political introspection of St. Lucia, in which I'm critical of both the St. Lucia Labour Party and the United Workers' Party, hasn't helped at all, for it has placed me at odds with supporters of both of our two major political parties. Hence the reason I named the book No Man's Land, for it is me that is in no man's land. Notwithstanding that my outsider status has put me in good company, I continue to feel uncomfortable calling myself a writer. So, realizing that when Toni Morrison, my favorite author and mentor, won the Nobel Prize, she had written only 6 novels, 6 books. I said to myself, if she can win the Nobel Prize with 6 books, surely that number of books should qualify me as a writer. So, I will need to wait for the publication of my 6th book, They Call Him Brother George, Portrait of a Caribbean Politician, before I can honestly accept the title of a writer. In 2017, 2018, after the publication of my 3rd book, The Stallkeeper, no matter that I was yet able to call myself a writer, I went on what I like to boast or call an international book tour, during which I did book readings and signings in Toronto, New York, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., London, Hartford, Connecticut, and Los Angeles. Financially, I couldn't describe the tour as a great success, but it was illuminating and inspiring and represented a turning point in my writing career. To begin with, I was taken aback by the great appreciation and pride of the diaspora for my books and for me as a writer. I was struck by the notion that St. Lucia's cultural space doesn't end with the island's physical boundary, but stretches across the ocean to Europe and North America and elsewhere. I was so inspired by the tour that when I got back, I decided that from now on, I will dedicate the rest of my life to writing books, and that I would put out a book at least every 2 years. Keeping true to this promise, I published my 4th book, My Father Is No Longer There, in 2019, 2 years after the publication of my previous book, The Stallkeeper. It was a book a long time coming. In 2002, my 78-year-old dad was killed while on his early morning walk by an out-of-control vehicle. As I said before, my father's accidental death. As I said before, my books are invariably sparked by events that left a lasting impression upon me. My father's accidental death would have ranked high among events that have left their imprint on me. So naturally, my father's death was a candidate for my writing. But when I started writing about my father, I wasn't sure whether I was going to be writing a book or just an essay. Nevertheless, I knew I would never regain my peace of mind if I didn't write about him. Moreover, his sudden death made it glaringly clear that I didn't know my father as well as a son whom he raised should know him. So getting to know my father was another reason for writing about him. In contrast to my previous 4 books, my latest book, No Man's Land, A Political Introspection of St. Lucia, wasn't so much sparked by an event that made a lasting impression upon me, but was sparked by an act of defiance. Late 2020, I attended a St. Lucia Labour Party political meeting. And there on the stage was Dr. Kenny Anthony saying, "View functions are defiant." So I thought the good doctor was about to say how view functions have resisted being exploited how Viewfortians are defiant, standing up to DSH and T.O.R. King and Alan Chastney in basically turning most of Viewfort over to a foreigner. I even thought he would have mentioned in the sugar days at the Viewfort sugar factory, when overseers, in order to get a job in the factory, one had to provide the overseers with a sister or even a wife or a daughter in order, as compensation for work. And in defiance, Viewfortians, instead of subjecting themselves to such humiliation, many Viewfortians took to the sea and started a life and turned to the sea fishing as a form of livelihood. So I thought this was where Dr. Kenny Anthony was going with his statement that Viewfortians are defiant. Only to find out he was saying Viewfortians are defiant because they are refusing to vote in UWP, and that they continue supporting the United Workers, the St. Lucia Labour Party. I said, this is not defiance. This is like being a doormat. Then later on, several months later, it came out that Dr. Kenny Anthony would run again for a sixth time for the Viewfort seat. I was even more annoyed. That annoyed me even more because I said to myself, Kenny Anthony has been the district rep for 25 years. 15 of those 25 years, he was the prime minister. Yet, he didn't set Viewfort on fire in terms of jobs, economic development. Now, through Dr. Anthony and his Labour governments have done applaudable work. And I cannot, and I've repeated many times that I think he made St. Lucia a kinder and gentler nation with all the footpaths and so on and so on. Also, I think it was I think it was great that he made secondary school universal. Because before him, we were being told we were too poor to have sufficient number of secondary schools for all our children to attend secondary school. But when he came in, with one stroke of the pen, he put in place so many secondary schools that today we have an overcapacity in secondary school seats. So, in some ways, Kenny Anthony should be applauded. But to me, after 25 years, 15 years as Prime Minister, his story has already been told. So it was time, I think, to step down and let a bona fide Viewfortian run for the seat, represent Viewfort. Because you see, when I look back, it seems most people that have represented Viewfort or run for the Viewfort seat have simply used the seat as a stepping stone to national prominence. Not necessarily that they are passionate about Viewfort. So I thought at this juncture it was a good opportunity for another Viewfortian, for this time a Viewfortian passionate about Viewfort and a demonstrated interest for Viewfort to run for the seat. So out of that annoyance came defiance. So I wrote an article, the Viewfort Leadership Crisis, basically explaining what I have just said. Well, on social media, the SLP supporters went ballistic I was cursed out, insulted. I was told I couldn't write. So I said, hey, I cannot be seen, or I cannot allow myself to be used as a tool of politicians. So to make sure I stand my ground, I came out with a second piece called The Chasney Ultimatum, which was basically saying that SLP seems to think they can win the election simply on Chasney must go. But even if we can agree, or some may agree, Chasney must go, the party needs to present a credible vision for the country. What are they going to do for the country? Not simply Chasney must go. And also, I thought the party needed to do some examination, self-examination, to find out why they lost the elections, the 2016 elections, to a UWP party led by a political novice, and one that was in disarray. Also, I indicated that Chasney is not the biggest problem facing the country. Corruption, constitutional reform, unemployment, crime, there were a host of other issues. I thought that was even a bigger issue than Chasney must go. So folks, SLP supporters didn't take too kindly to this. So at this point I said, well, since I have written 2 long pieces, and the only way I get paid for my writing is when I put it in the form of books and sell the books, I said, let me stop there, stop providing writing for free, and let me write a book which turned out to be No Man's Land, a political introspection of St. Lucia. So folks, and this is basically my journey as a writer from the time I got interested in writing, from the time I realized that I could write, and the time I realized that I was going to be writing books. So thanks very much for coming on this journey with me. It was a great pleasure. Of course, feel free to avail yourself of the books. They are available on Amazon and in several outlets in St. Lucia. So it was great. I did enjoy the presentation. Okay. So I'm told, I thought we were running out of time, so I think I have a few minutes left. Okay. So basically, so my next book, now I forgot to mention that I have kept my promise since after returning to St. Lucia from my book tour to have a launch, to put out a book every 2 years. I have done so good on that promise that now I'm ahead of schedule. No Man's Land came out in 2021, so my next book is due 2023, yet I'll be publishing my next book, they call him Brother George, this year. So again, I must thank the diaspora for being so kind to me on my tour, for showing such great appreciation and pride in me. It was a source of great encouragement. And I'm sure that encouragement was partly what inspired me to come back to St. Lucia and devote my life to writing books, to giving voice to all of our voices. Now maybe I will take just a few minutes to speak about the writer and St. Lucian Society. What role has the writer in St. Lucian Society? Writers like me, like Derek Worldcuts, Kendall Hippolyte, Modest Downs, Robert Lee, and a whole host of writers from St. Lucia. The other day, a woman asked me, what was my profession? In teasing her, I said that I was a writer. She said, "I did not know St. Lucia had writers. Once I was in Toronto at a St. Lucian party, and I mentioned to a fellow St. Lucian that I was working on a book that captures a lot of St. Lucian history. And his response was, what history St. Lucia has to write about? Apparently to some, not only do they not see a role for St. Lucian writers, they are not even aware that there were writers in St. Lucia. The writer and the artist in general speak truths about our society, and in such a way that we absorb the messages without even being aware that this is what is happening. The writer and the artist expose truths that would otherwise remain unexposed, because either it would not pay enough to make it worth the while of other persons whose end goal is an art itself, or because some in society would find the exposure of such messages an inconvenience to themselves. In other words, the artist speaks when no one else dares to or is incapable of speaking. Beyond beauty, aesthetics, atmosphere, and background, of what value are the truths that writers and artists speak? Let's take Derek Worldcuts' work. Beyond bringing recognition to St. Lucia, of what value is his work to St. Lucian society? Well, from his work, we get a sense of who we are as a people, where we come from, where we are heading. We get a sense of how our experiences compare with the whole scheme of human experiences through time and across distances and cultures. The Prime Minister, meaning Dr. Kenny, the former Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, Kenny and Toni, often talks about building a sense of nationhood, a sense we are all in these things together, a sense of national pride. Well, I think of no better way of forging a sense of nationhood than by cultivating a sense of our history. How did we get to where we are? What tribulations and catastrophes that we as a people have had to overcome? I don't know of any persons better suited than the writers and artists to point out to us the mistakes of the past and to depict, analyze, synthesize present-day society, so we as a people can put our society in historical, cultural, political, and international perspective. Why the artists? Well, the politicians have their hidden agendas. The pastors and priests are more concerned with the afterlife than with the now. The scientists are busy with inventions. The academicians are absorbed in the writing of esoteric papers that few other than themselves can access. The businessmen are occupied with profit-making, but in a pure form, the artist creates for creation's sake. Their agenda is art. Hence, the truths of which they speak can be better trusted, more so because the artist herself is guided by a hidden hand. For the artist creates as she is moved by the creative spirit. God is God through an act of creation. God is God through an act of creation, so the highest level of activity there is creativity. Thank you very much, St. Lucia, at home and abroad. It was fantastic. Tune in next Thursday at the same time, 9 for another, what I promise to be thrilling episode of Conversations with Dr. Anderson Reynolds. Thank you very much.